Hello and welcome to this episode of Philosophy for All. I'm your host Joshua Yen, and today we're joined by a really special guest, Joe Schmid, who is a PhD student of philosophy at Princeton University. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. We're going to be talking about the state of Christian YouTube and also how Christian YouTube has impacted his engagement with the philosophy of religion and some of his own projects and developments in academia. Joe Schmid, how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited for this. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. No, I've been following your content on the Majesty of Reason for quite some time, and you've done some really, really interesting interviews and talks with different leading professors and sharing your thoughts. And given your two recent videos on responding to Cameron's videos on why we should not take atheism seriously, I was like, you know what? This is something that's been somewhat bugging me as a Christian kind of content creator, if you could call me that. And I was like, maybe I should get an agnostic thought on this. So to get started off, where do you think Christian YouTube is heading? I mean, it's a very big sphere, but what are your thoughts on it in general?
Yeah, like you said, I mean, it's such a big sphere, so it's hard to paint broad brushstrokes. I mean, as I sort of see it, there are different kind of subgenres or maybe subfamilies of Christian YouTube. I mean, there's sort of like the channels which mainly do sort of Protestant versus Catholic and Orthodox kind of content. There are channels that mainly just do sort of broadly apologetic style content where they're trying to sort of convince you of the truth of Christianity or of God's existence. There are channels that are mostly like philosophy kind of stuff, like they do Christian philosophy, yes, but it's really just getting into the nitty gritty details of philosophy and academia and papers and books and whatnot, interviewing scholars. There are the kind of cultural critics and the cultural commentary, which talks about current issues, like the Olympics, remember that happened, the whole kind of controversy about the Last Supper or whatever, and all stuff about culture war and all that stuff. There are still other ones that are focused on spirituality and trying to help people grow spiritually and, giving them different prayers and things like that. And so, anyway, I can't paint any sort of broad brushstroke generalizations or conclusions about the state of Christian YouTube. But maybe I think what you're really asking about is like the more so apologetically inclined Christian content that I kind of tend to engage with a little bit more on my channel, and that maybe your viewers watch a little bit more. And in that regard, yeah, I mean, it looks, again, I mean, it's still pretty diverse even within that crowd. You got some which are kind of like, capturing Christianity, mixing up things with like, sometimes it's cultural commentary, sometimes it's arguments for and against God's existence, sometimes it's UFOs and aliens and demons, sometimes it's you never know what you're gonna get. And then maybe turning to like something like Trinity Radio with Braxton Hunter. I mean, again, sometimes it's like again, it seems to be a mix of cultural warrior stuff and apologetics stuff. So I can't, it's hard to answer that, but like one that I will shout out is The Analytic Christian from Jordan Hamden. It's like probably one of my favorite YouTube channels, and I watch it regularly, and it's like super scholarly, high quality, rigorous content, and he's never going to change that. So I don't quite know. I mean, I anticipate, here's what I anticipate things going. Because of the pressure for getting clicks and views and whatnot, which is a real pressure. I mean, people's jobs are on the line. Their families are on the line. Like, that really does matter. Because of that sort of pressure, I anticipate things going the direction where they get more clicks. And what is that? It's more culture war commentary style stuff. Yeah. So talking about gender issues, sexuality, other sorts of things, pop culture, things like that. I anticipate that getting more and more views, more and more traction, and hence coming to occupy a larger space within the kind of Christian YouTube sphere. So I don't know if that answers your question. I just kind of barfed out a lot of information, but I hope it was at least somewhat helpful.
Yeah, I feel it gives us a good place to start, and perhaps the preceding question, or the question which should follow that, is where do you find your channel going? Because I mean, you've been running quite a successful channel, which I think in the past feels to be a lot of interviews with scholars. It was very scholarly on the philosophy, of course, philosophy of religion side of things, but also very much philosophy related. And now I've seen some responses to you capturing Christianity. Where's the direction for that, and what's your thoughts behind your channel?
Yeah. So of course, we are talking about the objectively best channel that has ever existed. So, we need to have a little bit of, deference and respect whenever we are talking about, like the Majestic channel. I mean, but yeah. So, I mean, it's going nowhere. I mean, like the Analytic Christian. I mean, it's staying. It's going to be the staple academic content and lecture videos and whatnot. I mean, while there are response videos sprinkled in there, and I've done 2, very recent ones, as you just mentioned. They're always very scholarly. As you watch them, they get into some pretty nitty gritty details about theism, the literature, citing literature, and things like that. So that's really always going to be a staple. I don't really care if it doesn't get many views. It's what I'm interested in. It's what I'm passionate about. It's I really am trying to carve out a niche where, for the people who are interested in that, it's going to serve them. And while recognizing that it's not going to serve most people, and it's not going to be successful for most people. I mean, as of late, I have sort of been trying to like corral more people into that kind of academic thing by paying much more attention to my thumbnails and my titles and whatnot. Like, if people look at my channel and they go back to the very beginning, the thumbnails aren't great. The titles are usually not grabbing your attention. They're pretty scholarly and whatnot. They're pretty boring. But as of late, I've been more sensitive to at least trying to corral people in and trying to get them to click in the first place. But I'm never going to compromise on that content side of just being academic rigorous while still trying to be, accessible to the interested and relatively informed listener. But yeah, more recently, I've been like titling my videos with like all caps and like, things like that. And like, the thumbnails are getting a little bit more spicy sometimes. But yeah, and it's been successful. I mean, I've actually noticed an uptick of views on my channel since I've started doing that. Like my videos are regularly now getting more views because of that. So, but it's not because of the views. It's because I want to reach more people with rigorous, high quality content so that I can serve more people and get more people interested in philosophy of religion and philosophy, because philosophy is amazing and fun. So, yeah, my channel is going really nowhere. And in terms of like changing its modus operandi. And I am going to be continuing with pretty hardcore academic content. So yeah.
Do you think people are going to seem to move into our space of kind of more academic side of things, because this is not a criticism of Cameron. I think people watched my last video and are like, I thought I was really hating on his video. When I made it, I tried to make it as clear as I can to say I completely understand why he's doing it in that sense. And I just wonder whether this concern I have, which also seemed to resonate with a lot of some of my viewers and also people I've been talking to in Christianity, that, it seems to be people are getting a bit uncomfortable with that direction of this cultural wars. And they're like, well, I don't think Christianity or even the philosophy of religion as a whole should be really tangling itself with these things. Now, of course, as it was a meta question of what's the proper procedure of philosophy of religion, that's perhaps a bit of a different thing that we might be able to touch upon in a bit. But there's also the question of, people might get uncomfortable. Do you think people are then going to start jumping ship into the more academic stuff? Or do you think that's just a wild optimistic approach that I might have about the world?
I mean, this is all conjecture on my part, but my sense is that that's optimistic. I don't know. We, increasingly, there's like, I know a number of psychologists and even philosophers have been increasingly worried about the sort of attention crisis, and like our attention spans seem to be dwindling as time goes on with the rise of short form content, TikTok, which I think was banned today, maybe really? In the US. So, but anyway, the rise of like short form content, social media, all these sorts of things, like we're kind of endlessly scrolling, where we have a very short attention span. People find it difficult to like either sit down and listen to like an hour-long or 2-hour-long lecture or something like that, or like high-quality, rigorous academic content, or they even have difficulty doing that while they're doing other things. And it's not so much, I mean, we can't really blame them for that so much as like these companies which are, trying to put forward the short-form content and make that the major selling point. They are hiring psychologists and whatnot to try to basically hack into our brains and our psychology and get us addicted to that sort of thing. So it's like, we can't really criticize people too much for succumbing to what scientists have found they are very likely to be, succumb to by kind of manipulating our monkey brains. So I don't really foresee people jumping ship from that kind of content and switching over to the more academic content, at least on large scale. I mean, certainly some people are. I mean, some people are like, I've had enough of this UFO alien stuff. Let's start watching some Majesty of Reason. But I fear that they're kind of in the significant minority. But like I said, I've sort of come to grips with that, and I'm really just trying to carve out a niche where those sorts of people can be served, and served in the best way possible. So
and I think you're doing a very good job.
I appreciate it, and yours as well, of course. We're both in this niche, so
yes.
Yeah.
There's a lot I can learn from you. I'm still trying to grow and figure out how to make things work, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy that you're coming onto the channel to talk to you about it. And one thing's perhaps the development of it is what motivated you to start this channel in the first place? Was that because you first got into the philosophy of religion from an academic side and said, this could be a way for me to engage with more professors, more works, or was it more, I find this niche on YouTube quite interesting, I'm going to get into that first, and then you develop the academic side? What came first? I'm not sure it's a chicken or an egg thing. Or
yeah, I mean, there are a billion reasons why I started the YouTube channel. I mean, there's the more causal historical story, and then there's the more like normative sort of justification, the kind of reason behind doing it. So like, I could tell you the causal historical story first. So it's, I mean, how far does it go back? Where do I go? It's like, do I go back to like when humanity first evolved, or, no, but for me, I grew up in a very devout Christian household. I was a devout believer. I, went to church regularly. And then in 7th and 8th grade, I love science, and we started learning evolution, and I went to private education, private Christian education, K through 12, in fact. But thankfully, it was a Catholic school, and Catholics are in general very open to science, and they're they big on the harmony between faith and reason and whatnot. So my school was totally cool with teaching mainstream, good quality science. So in 7th and 8th grade, we learned about evolution for the first time, and it was so fascinating to me. I just thought it was so magnificent and beautiful how, as Charles Darwin put it, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Like, I remember looking at my hand and I was like, oh my goodness, this is the product of like billions of years of evolution. And I was like, oh my gosh, that is so crazy. So I started devouring stuff relating to evolution because I was just so interested in it. And in fact, I actually minored in biology in college at Purdue University. So carrying on, I studied some evolutionary biology in college because I still have that interest. But that's just an aside. So yeah, we're back to 8th grade, and I start reading books and reading stuff online about evolution and whatnot. And I then started to wonder how that kind of meshed with my Christian beliefs, like Adam and Eve and the Bible and all that stuff. So then I found my way into various forums, social media. I had started talking with people about the young earth creationism versus evolution style debates. That got me thinking about Genesis. Then I found the BioLogos Institute, run by, I think, Francis Collins, where they try to propose a kind of theistic evolutionary story, or a theistic evolutionary picture of reality where God kind of guides evolution. Found all their resources, read his book. I think it's called like The Language of God or something like that. Read Richard Dawkins' books. I've got one right next to me, in fact, The Greatest Show on Earth, which is actually
one. I haven't seen this before.
No, this is a very old one. So actually, like, this isn't really a kind of polemical cringe new atheist stuff. This is just a compilation of scientific evidence for evolution. It's I remember it being quite good. But anyway, so I was interested in evolution, and then started getting into these debates. And naturally enough, that's starting to get me thinking about like, oh man, God, theism. And so then I started reading much more online, started debating people much more online about these sorts of topics in religion. Then I started really questioning my beliefs at this point, because I was thinking like, I mean, man, the evolutionary process, think about that. I mean, it's been hundreds of millions of years of animals ripping each other to shreds and preying on one another and parasitizing one another. And this is the very means or mechanism by which God is bringing about biological diversity in general and humans in particular. So I was like, that doesn't seem like what a perfectly good, perfectly loving, fully providential, omnipotent being would do. So that kind of got me down the path of really questioning my beliefs. And then I started watching debates between philosophers. I watched William Lane Craig, and I started getting into, in fact, Paul Draper's work. So this is in high school now, like 9th and 10th grade. I got introduced to Paul Draper's work. And that was actually through a debate between Frank Turek and Jeff Lauder, which is a really good debate, at least on Jeff Lauder's part, not so much Frank Turek's part, but yeah. Anyway, I watched that debate. That got me interested in like Bayes' theorem, probability, like Paul Draper's works. I started reading philosophy, and all the while I was watching YouTube. And YouTube is also largely what was driving this whole process. Like I was watching debates on there. I was watching channels. I remember Relay Theology back in the day, man. I was in high school. Justin Schieber. It was the old Justin Schieber before he made the return. Justin Schieber was on there, and he's making really cool videos summarizing Paul Draper stuff and Divine Hiddenness stuff. So I watched Relay Theology. And then in a junior year, so throughout this process, I eventually lost my faith, became a kind of naturalist atheist. Mostly as a result of like Paul Draper's work, but also a lot of other stuff that I've been thinking about. So then in junior year, I came across, it was the summer after junior year, I think. The summer before or the summer after. And I came across this channel called Worldview Design. And there are all these really cool videos on like modal cosmological arguments and other sorts of things that I'd never heard of. I was like, oh my goodness.
Logic, which gets you back into it, isn't it?
Right, yes. So then I was like, oh my goodness, there's this whole domain of like new, like, and I mean like new arguments. Like, so Worldview Design, that's by Dr. Josh Rasmussen.
Yes.
He was making videos at the time when I was in high school. And I was like, and this is at the time when he's like actively writing the book Necessary Existence with Alexander Proust. And so like these are like brand new arguments that I come across. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've never seen these arguments, and they seem kind of forceful to my mind. So anyway, but I still had some objections. So I reached out to Josh Rasmussen, and I was like, hey, I've got some objections. Do you want to talk about them? And so we went back and forth through email a bunch. And we did that throughout my whole senior year and maybe also my junior year. So anyway, this is all getting me into kind of the academic side of philosophy of religion. And throughout this whole process, I made tons of documents of my own, developing arguments and developing. I made like blog posts. I blogged at the time on my old blog. And so I was myself making all this content, trying to synthesize things of my own. I made documents containing different arguments that I thought were convincing and developing them, criticizing arguments that I thought weren't successful. I remember at one point I had like a 500-page document of like arguments, like arguments for and against God's existence, like assessing them and whatnot during high school. And so anyway, this is just my whole process of getting into philosophy. And all of that then brought me into college, where I studied philosophy and biology. And at some point, I was originally going the biology track because I didn't think that I could get a job in philosophy. I was worried about that. But some mentors, including some of my high school teachers, but also some mentors in college, were like, hey, Joe, like, I really do think you can sort of make it through philosophy and get a job at the end of it, or at least you have a good shot. So they kind of encouraged me, and I went into philosophy as a result of that. Okay, so then how does this all relate to my channel? Well, all of this is set up. I'm coming back to it. So, the audience, don't think I've lost track. I'm not just rambling. I'm partly rambling, but I'm not fully rambling. Okay, so yeah, I'm in college now at this point. And one thing that I forgot to mention was that coming across those new arguments from Josh Rasmussen and interacting with him actually awakened me from my dogmatic metaphysical naturalist slumbers. So I sort of was no longer an atheist, and I sort of became an agnostic. So, by which I mean at least suspending judgment on the question of whether or not God exists. And that has persisted with some slight, shifts here and there and whatnot up until today. But that was another shift. But anyway, going back to where I was, now we're in college. In I think it was my sophomore year of college, COVID hits. So, and, when it was first starting, everyone's like, there's this weird new illness that's cropping up in China, and we don't really know what's going on. And then the CDC declares that it's a global epidemic, and then everyone freaks out. And so I think pretty much most schools in the United States, most colleges send their people home, their students home. So I was sent home from Purdue and this is like March of 2020 or something, we were sent home, and the professors don't know what's going on. They had this whole shift in plans. So, and we're sort of near the end of the semester. We got like a month left of the semester. So a lot of professors were like, you know what, like, just like write your last paper or something. You're like, just finish this last take-home exam, and then we'll just call it a semester. Like, because no one knows what's going on. We're freaking out. Like, okay, so that means I had a lot of free time on my hands. I'm sent home, and I've got nothing to do. And I've got like I said, I've got a 500-page document. I've got bunches of other documents. I've got email correspondences. I've got blog posts that I've made. So I was like, you know what? Like, I'm going to collect all this together. And I was really interested in critical thinking at the time as well, like how to think critically, how to reason about all these topics. And so I had compiled a lot of information already on critical thinking and, argumentation and reasoning and whatnot. I had made a lot of that into blog posts. I already had a lot in documents and whatnot. I was like, you know what? I've got barely no homework. So I'm going to self-publish a book. I'm going to put all this together and like put it all into this book, The Majesty of Reason, A Short Guide to Critical Thinking and Philosophy. And so I self-published that. And that came out around the time when I decided, you know what? I've got a lot of content. I think it'll be fun. I watch YouTube videos, and I was kind of served by YouTube videos in my intellectual development. I'm going to make a YouTube channel because, again, I had so much time on my hands. So anyway, that's how it was born. It was born April 20th, 4/20, 2020. And it was history from there. So, so that's the kind of causal historical side of things. But like, why? What reason? Why did I do it? Well, I've sort of already paved the way for that. Something that really kind of got me into philosophy and changed my mind in so many different ways was videos on YouTube, lectures by philosophers and by people like Relay Theology and by debates between Jeff Lauder and Frank Turek. These are things that inspired me and ultimately inspired me to become a professional philosopher. So if that sort of thing can happen with me, it can happen with other people. So I was like, there's a lot of untapped potential to be able to serve people and, kind of pay it forward. I was served by other people taking time out of their busy schedules to make high quality, rigorous academic content accessible to a broader audience. And so then why not do that myself? So that's one of the main reasons. It's just to really to kind of pay it forward. I was served so much by people who did that when I was growing intellectually. And I kind of, I see an opportunity for me to help people in that regard. And I've got a lot of content that I had already put together. I already produced a lot of content academically, so why not repurpose it and explain it to a popular audience? I already read, a lot of, part of my job basically is just to read papers and books. That's literally part of my job. So why not then just summarize them for a popular audience and put them out there? So that's a lot of the justification, a lot of the reasoning as to why I made the channel is to sort of pay it forward, is to serve people through rigorous, high quality academic content, to try to help them think better, to help them think critically, to give them the tools, the methods and tools to think critically. Even if people don't ultimately come to my conclusions, I think my conclusions are ultimately correct. I hope people come to them when I argue for them on my channel, but that's ultimately not really the goal. The goal is really so that they can kind of see how good philosophy is done, the methods and tools of doing philosophy, making distinctions, drawing on conceptual resources from logic and whatnot. That's the bigger takeaway, is that people can kind of learn the methods and skills and tools of philosophy, critical thinking, and reasoning. So that's a long story. And there are other reasons, of course, as well. It's fun. I enjoy it. I can convince people to not adopt more potentially harmful views that bring them down the pipeline of reactionary politics and whatnot, and reactionary religious views. I can, make connections, forge connections with different scholars in my field. That has opened up so many different opportunities. If I hadn't reached out to Graham Oppy, for instance, near the beginning of my channel and started, reading a lot of his papers, but also sharing with some of my papers and current work of mine with him, he would have never been aware that I was doing a ton of research on modal ontological arguments, and then also would never have invited me and Josh Rasmussen on to be co-authors for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy Entry on Ontological Arguments. All of this was facilitated by my reaching out to him, inviting him onto my channel, being kind to him, helping him, giving him feedback on his stuff, and then sharing my stuff with him. Like, all this was forged through the YouTube channel and whatnot. So like, that's just one example. So that's another kind of outshoot of the channel, is that it's allowed me to forge really good connections, make really good relationships with people, and just put my kind of academic work out there as well. Which is another one final thing that I'll mention is, like, academics, oftentimes the number of people on average who read their papers is like 3 or something. One is them. The 2 is their mother, and then the number 3 is like the editor of the journal. Oh, and okay, maybe 4 and 5, the 2 reviewers who reviewed the paper. Okay, so like 5 people who read the paper, but that's not the case with, firstly, myself now, because a bunch of people are reading my papers because I do videos on them and I put them in the description and whatnot. So now a bunch of more people are aware of my work, but also, secondly, I'm making a bunch of people aware of other people's work who I platform, like Liz Jackson and Brian Cutter and Graham Oppie and Josh Rasmussen and all the other people that I platformed. So it's just a way to spread good philosophy, good thinking, good reasoning. So, oh my goodness, that's a lot. I went along there, but I hope it gives people a glimpse.
Yeah, no, and I think it's brilliant. I mean, how do you say it? You could probably see how much I'm smiling because of how much that resonates with me, because in some sense, a lot of that, the reasons why you're doing it to really get to know more people, to share academic content and whatnot's really the same direction that I try to do on my channel. And there's so much we could talk about based on your story. And perhaps just a quick question. I just have a question about, what was your Christian background? People might be interested in, what were you a young earth creationist, given kind of your focus on evolution? What denomination were you part of? How strongly did you adhere to the tenets of that denomination? Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah. So the quote unquote denomination, I mean, I'm not sure if it's properly denominated a denomination. I grew up Catholic and very staunchly and very devoutly. So yes, adhered to all the tenets, believed all the things. Went to, I mean, like I said, private Catholic school, K through 12. So like just during K through 8, it was mass 3 times a week during the weekdays, but then also Sunday with family.
Yes.
So 4 times a week, like going through everything. And yes, of course, I believed it all very wholeheartedly. Yeah, definitely, 100%. And yeah, I mean, what was the other parts of your question?
Were you a young earth creationist just because of the Genesis? Or
yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, I think it was sort of like, there's no fact of the matter about what I believed prior to learning about evolution, because I'd sort of never really thought about it. Like, I mean, I thought that there was such a thing as, Adam and Eve, and God created them and whatnot. But I didn't have any views, like, before learning about evolution, about the how long the universe had been around, or like how long the Earth had been around. I just hadn't thought of that at all. So completely indeterminate there. No fact of the matter about what I believed. And then and then when I learned in 7th and 8th grade about evolution, I mean, one thing that was also pretty pivotal is, like, man, my 7th and 8th grade science teacher was amazing. I think his name was, I forget. I think it was like Mr. Adams. I forget his name. But anyway, he's obviously not watching this, but if you were, that'd be so cool. But yeah, no,
I got a comment in the comments like, oh, that's Joe.
Well, no. My credence for that person faking is higher, because anyway. Yeah. But anyway. So yeah, I mean, he was super cool, because when we talked about evolution, he literally played for us, because I was in like 7th or 8th grade during the time of the actual debate between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. This is like 2014 or something. So I think I was in maybe 8th grade then, maybe 7th grade. I forget. But anyway, we played it and we watched it and we had to write an essay on it, like talking about our views and like the pros and cons of each of the sides and whatnot. It was so cool. And just that sort of got me really interested in these sorts of debates and thinking really critically and very seriously about these sorts of topics. So yeah, I mean, once I learned about evolution, I mean, I kind of and watched that debate. At the time, I thought Bill Nye pretty handily won, and after reading a bunch more, buying textbooks of my own and whatnot, like I've got some of them behind me, in fact, biology textbooks and whatnot. I definitely settled on the side of evolution, and I was a pretty staunch advocate, in fact, of theistic evolution for a while before I kind of became an atheist. I was fully bought into the kind of Biologos Institute kind of view, where God guided evolution, and hey, that's compatible with the faith and whatnot. And so anyway, that was sort of my view.
And how do you think philosophy ties in with faith? Because there's one view where I suppose in your search for, I guess, God, or in your search in agnosticism, or your study of these arguments, there's almost a tendency to say, well, I'll just follow where these arguments lead. And I know in my experience, sometimes, because personally, I'll lay my cards out on the table. When I look at the arguments for the existence of God, I think perhaps most likely there's a God, but I wouldn't say, oh, definitely, I think all of these arguments work. I think they're good objections to some of them. And I'm still somewhat on the fence towards the degree in which natural reason can be used to demonstrate the existence of God. But sometimes I separate that from my faith quite wholeheartedly. Not to say there is no influence. If I did believe the logical problem of evil was successful, then maybe I would suddenly stop being a theist. But I still kind of try to separate the fields slightly to at least have a bit of a buffer zone there. Has that ever kind of crossed your mind? Or perhaps on the other side, if you were an agnostic to come to faith, perhaps you had a religious experience, as a random example, would you then decide to come to faith even if you didn't think the philosophy was necessarily up to scratch to support those beliefs?
Yeah, really, really good questions here. I mean, part of it will rest on what exactly faith is. There's huge philosophical literature on this. I don't have settled views about what faith is, but like roughly, I mean, he has a very rough characterization. Faith is a kind of it's a kind of complex state that someone can sort of be in, and it's a complex consisting of, this is sort of following Liz Jackson and some other people in the literature, a kind of more cognitive or desire-like component, and then a more cognitive or maybe belief-like component. Okay, so faith has these sorts of two components: cognitive, cognitive. Let's focus on the cognitive component. This is a more kind of like desire-like component. It's maybe the object of faith, whether it be a person or something creedal, some sort of proposition. But the object of faith, you have some sort of positive pro-attitude towards it. Like you desire it to be the case. You regard it as good for the relevant proposition to be the case, or for the relevant creed or religion to be the case, or to have a relationship with a relevant person. You would regard that as good or something desirable. So it's some sort of like desire-like component where you regard the thing as good. It's maybe an appropriate object of hope. Maybe it's something you regard as good, something that you desire. So that's the more cognitive side of things, side of faith. And then there's the more cognitive side of faith, which I said was belief-like. Now, there's debate in the literature about whether or not faith requires like belief, like full-blown assent to the relevant proposition in which you have faith. Jonathan Quanvig, famously, along with a number of others, argue that no, you don't actually need full-blown belief. But typically still, even proponents of these non-doxastic accounts of faith hold that you need some sort of doxastic-like component. Like maybe, it's you have some sort of decent degree of credence in it, or some sort of decent degree of confidence. Like you're not, I mean, minimally, you certainly, heck, you can't be like absolutely certain that it's false. Like it wouldn't be, it wouldn't make sense to say, yeah, I have faith that we're going to win the game, but I'm absolutely certain that we're going to lose. That doesn't seem to make any sense. It seems like you have to have some sort of like, you have to regard it maybe as like a live possibility, or like something that might be true, or like it has to have like maybe non-negligible credence or something along those lines. So like maybe not full-blown belief, but like it has to be a live possibility in your epistemic life. Like it could be true, it might be true, and you have a somewhat decent credence in it, but non-negligible. At minimum. And maybe it requires full-blown faith. Maybe it requires full-blown belief. So we got these two components then. And then how does that relate to the more philosophical side of things? Well, we can marshal philosophical reasons for thinking that, for instance, the relevant object of faith is good and desirable. It's like worthy of being desired. And that's where the kind of pro-theism, anti-theism debate would come in. Pro-theists think it would be a good thing if God were to exist, or if theism were true. Anti-theists, roughly speaking, think, no, it would be a bad thing. Things on the whole would be worse if God were to exist than if God weren't to exist. I fall on the pro-theism side of the debate. I think, like if God exists, there's there's this perfect being in charge of everything. How could that clearly that makes the world better, in my view, at least. There's God can redeem the world. He can kind of fix the brokenness of creation. He can do, basically, like if we accept problems of evil, we think that or if we're sympathetic to certain versions of the problem of evil, or at least certain premises in certain versions of the problem of evil, we think that if God were to exist, he would have to have some sort of good reason for allowing the evils to occur, and there'd be like ultimately the world in the end is going to be good on the whole, one might think. Many proponents, in fact, of the problem of evil are committed to that sort of thing. So then if we think, well, anyway, I think that these sorts of considerations lead to a kind of pro-theism. So that leads me to think that, no, things actually would be pretty good if God were to exist. Things would be, like, I think that's a proper object of desire. Like, I think it's appropriate to desire that God exists, and to regard that as a kind of good sort of thing. So that philosophy can then have a bearing on that more conative side of things. And it can also have a bearing on the more cognitive side of things, like arguments for and against God's existence. Maybe even if they can't get you all the way to belief or something like that, they can still render theism a live option. They can maybe render certain particular religions a live option. They can afford you, they as in the relevant arguments and reasons that philosophers and historians debate. They can, at least justify having a non-negligible credence in perhaps certain tenets of religions, or at least minimally God's existence. So philosophy is definitely relevant to faith, because it bears on the two widely recognized components of faith. But maybe we think that there's also a more kind of practical dimension of faith as well. There's like the actionable side of things. Like if you have faith, oftentimes you take action. Like you are willing to put things on the line for the faith. Like you're willing to involve some level of trust. You're willing to take certain actions. Maybe you're willing to go to church or other sorts of things. But maybe it also involves a practical dimension. And maybe philosophy doesn't get you to that. Like maybe that requires some sort of motivational, more personal kind of thing. Maybe. So anyway, this is all. It's lots of different debates here. Very, very complicated. And philosophy is very, very relevant to faith. I don't know the conditions under which, faith is rationally required or practically required or rationally permissible or practically permissible. I don't have a worked out theory here. And I've also sort of lost sight of the precise question you asked. I mean, I sort of think I'm addressing.
I think you asked,
how does philosophy interact with faith? And that's sort of what I'm saying. Like philosophy definitely has a bearing on faith, but maybe it can't get you all the way because it involves the more practical side of things as well. And philosophy is, sort of, you sit in the armchair and you read and whatnot. That doesn't really get you out of your seat or out of the bed and into the church, into the pews.
Yes, and perhaps, there's two things which I want to touch upon. Perhaps one, you talked about some of the arguments and some of the doubts you may have in relationship to God and stuff, despite being a pro-theist. I would like to touch upon that, and then I'll talk about the follow-up question just to give you the frame in which I'm presenting it, is to say, well, okay, assuming those doubts were eased, or perhaps you became convinced, then following on to your idea of, okay, there's a practical side of faith. I was wondering, assuming those doubts are eased, would you then start becoming a thoroughgoing Sunday mass following Catholic, perhaps? Now, of course, there's perhaps a gap between, okay, God exists and the God of Catholicism is true. But I suppose if there was that link there, would you make that jump?
Well, yeah, it all depends on the details of the case, right? So like if we're merely talking about theism, like, suppose I were convinced of theism, that alone doesn't get me to any particular religion. I'd be much more interested then in like in a lot more depth than I currently do. Like right now I focus more so on the philosophical side of things. But if I were to become convinced of theism, then I would regard it as much more pressing to try to figure out, like, if this God that I do in fact think exists has, sort of revealed himself in a particular religion or something like that, or maybe in multiple religions. So I'd want to definitely, sort of investigate, Hinduism and Christianity and Islam and Buddhism and Judaism, etc. Not that I have completely ignored that. I certainly haven't. But it would become much more urgent if I thought that there really was a God, because it seems quite likely, if God exists and he creates finite creatures capable of relating with him, it'd be really weird for like God to just sort of sit back and not kind of relate to them, like not not somehow establish a means or mechanism by which these finite creatures capable of relationship with God could then relate to God. So I would then at least investigate the various religions, and then if I found that one of them is indeed correct, if that gap were crossed, or that bridge were crossed in my mind, well then yeah, I definitely start attending church, or maybe going to the mosque if I thought that Islam were true, or going to the temple if it were some other religion. So yeah, I mean, definitely. I'm definitely not apathetic in that sense, where I could be convinced of the truth of the relevant religion and whatnot, but that could be sort of divorced from my practical life. No, I actually would definitely attend church, for instance, if I were convinced of the truth of Christianity and whatnot, like without a doubt. Yeah. I mean, I already, like, as an agnostic, I actually think that there are really good arguments for thinking that, I mean, it's a bold claim to say that this is rationally required or maybe practically required, although I may think that, but at least it's rationally permissible, I think, to for an agnostic to say kind of like something like conditional prayers, like, God, if you exist, like, can you either show yourself to me, or like, could you please help me develop in virtue, or things like that, like various things like that. So I think that makes eminent practical and rational sense as agnostic. I mean, you can liken it to if you're trapped in a deserted forest, and you're like, you have a pretty high credence that like there actually are rescue teams out there looking for you, and you have like something by which you can get their attention, like you've got the flare. It seems like you should shoot the flare, right?
Yes.
Even if you're only 50% confident, say, that there are teams out there looking for you. So you're 50% confident that this would be a complete waste of time, and that there's no one out there who's looking out for you, caring for you. But you're also 50% confident that they are. Of course, you should shoot the flare, right? And so agnostic conditional prayer is kind of like shooting the flare. I see it like, maybe, yeah, sure, maybe agnostics don't have to be like 50% exactly, but they've got like a pretty decent credence that there's no one out there. No one's out there. Like, no one cares about, no one's listening to your silly prayer like that. You've got that kind of decent credence in that. But they've also got a decent credence that there is someone out there who is listening, who may very well care, and who may very well be able to help. So then I think it's eminently rational for an agnostic to say those sorts of conditional prayers. So that's already something in the practical life. And Paul Draper makes this point in his paper, Confessions of a Practicing Agnostic. It's a really good paper. I resonate very much with that paper. Highly recommend people read it. So anyway, that's one practical side of agnosticism, in fact, that I already sort of subscribe to. So that's evidence that I would still, evidently I'd go to church, or like I'd carry out the practical side of things if that bridge were crossed, as you said.
And turning to your agnosticism, and I mean, you engage with the philosophy of religion way more than I do. Even though I have somewhat interest in philosophy of religion, especially with anti-theodicy and that, most of my work's done in the continental field and the philosophy of literature. But I was wondering, talk about your credence about God and your agnosticism. What are the arguments which you think are the most likely to succeed, and what are the arguments which are most likely to prove damning for theism?
Yeah, so I mean, the cheating answer here is to say cumulative cases in both directions, right? To like look at the total evidence and then develop a cumulative case. But that's kind of cheating. I know what you're asking. You're not asking about cumulative cases. You're asking about particular arguments, which might be the most forceful. Okay, but my answer is really cumulative case. We need to look at the total evidence and see which hypothesis fares better in light of the total evidence. Okay, but particular pieces of evidence that are, or maybe particular arguments that are particularly potentially powerful. Got some alliteration going on. So on the atheistic side, many viewers probably already know what I think is one of the strongest arguments for atheism, or maybe naturalism, something like that. Is something like the problem of evolutionary animal suffering. This is actually what sort of got me to become a metaphysical naturalist in the first place, together with lots of other arguments, like problems in the Bible, which eventually got me out of Christianity, and then other various problems for theism, which got me out of that. But it's the problem of evolutionary animal suffering. Yeah, I mean, there just have been hundreds of millions of years of sentient creatures seemingly, experiencing kind of like a sort of hellish existence. I mean, like the natural state, as Dawkins rightly puts it, that sort of natural state of nature is a state of scarcity. It's a state of animals having to voraciously rip each other to shreds in order to sustain themselves. It's having to prey upon one another, having to parasitize one another, having to starve after being burned in a forest fire, natural disasters, languishing. I mean, all this stuff is just rife throughout evolutionary history for hundreds of millions of years. And this, of course, is not just like an unfortunate byproduct of pretty particularly good system. I mean, this is like the very means or mechanism by which that system operates. It's like the weak and the helpless are systematically discarded in favor of the vicious and the predators. It's like the weak lose, the innocent lose. I don't know. It just seems such a terrible way to create.
Yes.
And especially when you could have like made an evolutionary process where all the animals are like herbivores, or they photosynthesize, or they get their energy from the air around them, or instead of having to die through like forest fires and lying in agony after having severe 3rd-degree burns for days and then starving to death, instead of that, like the animals could just perish through kind of painless natural laws that just give them a fixed kind of lifespan or something. Like there's so many imaginable ways that an omnipotent being could have brought about biological diversity in humans. But instead you chose this like bloodbath way. It just seems so implausible to me. And of course we can put this in like Bayesian terms and whatnot, but like this is, I'm just, articulating things informally for a popular audience. Trust me, as viewers of my channel, no, I can get into like the Bayes machine goes brrr, and I can put all the equations up and I can give numbers. We could do that, but I'm not doing that here. So just giving you a kind of glimpse, putting things informally. So that pulls on me a lot, and it still does.
Yes.
So in my view, that's one of the major considerations favoring atheism, and then lots of different considerations favoring theism. Maybe two of the potentially most forceful are, one would be maybe contingency style arguments. So, like we look around us, there are things that can fail to exist. They exist, but they can fail to exist, like my water bottle here, or me, or basically anything around me right now. They exist, but they didn't have to exist. They could have failed to exist. And hey, lo and behold, whenever we see things that can fail to exist, contingent things, both individually and collectively, they seem to have explanations for their existence. If we came across an orb when we were walking in the forest, no one would even take seriously for a second that the orb just either came into existence without any explanation or has just existed for eternity without any explanation. Like, it just seems to be the kind of thing that calls out for explanation, and we might think that that's true for any contingent thing more generally. Like, even if the orb were the size of the universe, we might think it still cries out for some kind of explanation. And this sort of explanatory principle is supported inductively. We might think it's intuitive. We might think that science presupposes it. We might think that if you deny it, you might be cast into a kind of radical skepticism. These are all very controversial arguments, but hey, given that explanatory principle and given that there are contingent things, we can ultimately arguably arrive at some sort of necessary foundation for contingency, because there needs to be some sort of, per that principle, there needs to be some sort of explanation for why there are contingent things. Can't be in terms of a contingent thing, because that's part of the very thing we're seeking an explanation of. So arguably it must be in terms of a necessary thing. And then people try to argue through, at least by my lights, somewhat implausible means, but they might still have some chance of succeeding. That this necessary foundation is God, or at least has an appropriate array of divine attributes. So anyway, it's an interesting argument. It's a reasonable argument, and it's among the more forceful arguments for theism. And then, so that's one. And then another one might just be perhaps the fine-tuning argument, maybe. Of course, there are potential worries that one might raise for it, but like there's something strange if, the scientists find out that, like, in order for any complex structures to exist, especially ones that can harbor value, like, complex brains, which can harbor consciousness, and beings which can engage in relationships with one another and with a creator, if there is one. It'd be pretty shocking if, you found that had, like, without some sort of directedness toward that end result, it'd be pretty surprising, if you got that, given that its chances are overwhelmingly low. So, there's something maybe to fine-tuning arguments. Again, there are objections that people can raise, multiverse stuff, electrons in love, etc. But I still do think these are among the more forceful arguments for theism. So anyway, those two are ones that I would immediately mention off the top of my head.
That's quite fascinating. You do talk about cumulative cases as being the, I suppose, how at the end of the day we're going to be engaging or putting these together. I was wondering how that, I suppose, would go forward. Is it just a case of Bayesian probability, saying what's the probability after these arguments, what's the probability after that, and calculating them against each other? And also, how do they interact? Because, for example, the argument from evolutionary suffering, you could seemingly almost put that against a fine tuning and say, well, on one hand, it's kind of unlikely for things to have been the way they are, and perhaps all the suffering is just a natural or a necessity of these fine-tuned constants or whatnot. And on the other hand, you could say, well, actually, no, that kind of counts against it in some ways. How do you, I suppose, how is someone meant to put these cases together?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, the ideal, here's the sort of, I don't think anyone lives up to this, but like the sort of ideal kind of Bayesian strategy here would be to try to fix on some reasonable assessment or estimate of the intrinsic probabilities of theism and atheism, or maybe we'd have to pick alternative hypotheses that are sufficiently fleshed out, like a particular version of theism and a particular version of naturalism. And then we'd have to try to assess their respective intrinsic probabilities. So that's the probabilities of each of them independently of any evidence whatsoever. And that's then just going to be a function of what the hypotheses themselves say. And so when you do that, you want to look at, well, do the hypotheses have any kind of internal tensions among them? Like, does one part of a hypothesis conflict with other parts of the hypothesis? One way you could have internal tension is if you specify that God really loves cheese, but he hates dairy products. That's a kind of tension. Like, one of those gives us a reason to think that the other is false. Yes. They're not inconsistent. They're not strictly inconsistent, but like there's a kind of tension there. And that's going to lower the probability of your hypothesis if you have tensions like that within your hypothesis. So we look at the features of the hypothesis. We see if there are any kind of internal conflicts or internal tensions within the hypotheses. We also see how maybe how simple they are or how modest they are. Maybe how much do they demand of reality? And other things being equal, more modest hypotheses are going to be more intrinsically probable because they're compatible with more ways for reality to be. They don't rule out as much. They don't demand as much of reality. And so there are fewer ways for them to be false. And so they're going to be more probable intrinsically prior to looking at any evidence. And so then we look at these various features which affect the intrinsic probability of hypotheses. We try to develop theories of what affects intrinsic probability. And then we try to get reasonable estimates of intrinsic probabilities, maybe reasonable ranges that they could fall in, and really reasonable comparative estimates. Like, is one of them much more intrinsically probable than another? By which I mean is like one of these hypotheses, namely like the fleshed out theism that we're talking about, is that much more intrinsically probable than, or much less intrinsically probable than, or roughly as intrinsically probable than the relevant fleshed out version of naturalism. So we need some sort of theory of intrinsic probability. We need to apply it to the respective hypotheses that we want to get the kind of, cumulative case assessment about. And so then we come to a conclusion about what their intrinsic probabilities are. Then after we do that, we get some sort of natural partition of the relevant evidence that we want to update on or conditionalize on. So maybe we got like fine tuning, we've got psychophysical harmony, we've got divine hiddenness, we've got evil, we've got, well, not just evil, but all the different kinds of evil, like suffering and whatnot. We've got, the existence of consciousness, we've got other sorts of things. And then we basically just use Bayes' theorem and systematically proceed through all these pieces of evidence and one after another update on them. So then we basically, we use, let's say, the odds form of Bayes' theorem, which tells us that the posterior probability, the ratio of the posterior probabilities of hypotheses, conditional on some evidence, is a function of the ratio between the hypotheses of how likely the evidence is on those hypotheses times the ratio of the prior probabilities of the hypotheses. And so then for our first piece of evidence that we look at, the ratio of the priors is just going to be the intrinsic probabilities. So like you plug in the intrinsic probabilities there. And then for the first piece of evidence that we look at how probable is that evidence conditional on the one hypothesis? How probable is it conditional on the other? So maybe the first piece of evidence we look at is just that, the universe is fine-tuned or something like that. Or maybe there is a universe or, whatever. And then we plug in the relevant numbers or at least the relevant ratios. And then we get the posterior probability, the ratio of the posterior probabilities of those hypotheses conditional on that piece of evidence.
Mhm.
And then that becomes our new prior. So then the ratio there becomes our new prior ratio. So you put that over, that's our new prior ratio. And then we look at the next piece of evidence. And we assess how likely is that piece of evidence given the relevant hypothesis, together with that other piece of evidence that we just conditionalized on, right? Because that's now in our background, because we've already taken it into account. So that goes in our background. Then we assess how likely is the next piece of evidence conditional on the hypothesis together with that. And then we compare that with the respective hypotheses. We do the multiplication, and then we get another posterior probability. And then that becomes our prior probability for the next piece of evidence. We then do the same process, and then we just systematically proceed through all the relevant pieces of evidence, being careful not to double count, being careful to take pieces of evidence and put them in our background after we've conditionalized on them, etc. And then at the very end, you're left with the probability of the respective hypotheses conditional on all the evidence.
Mhm.
And that gives you the probability of the hypotheses on the whole. And then we get some sort of principle that you should proportion your credences to the evidential probabilities, to like the probabilities of the evidence, the probabilities of the hypotheses conditional on the relevant evidence and whatnot. And then bada bing, bada boom, that's your credence in the relevant hypotheses. Now, this is all kind of silly. No one has done this.
Mhm.
I don't think anyone's ever going to do it. I mean, so like, I mean. What are we to do then? I mean, I don't really know. I mean, listen, we just try our hardest. Like, roughly try to think about, when we're evaluating hypotheses, roughly try to think about how likely are they individually prior to looking at the evidence, and then try to scale up from there. Basically, how well they explain the data, and you just try to do that with the total range of data, and then you just try to come to the best conclusion that you can. And it's immensely difficult. And because it's immensely difficult, we should have an appropriate degree of epistemic humility here. But yeah, I mean, that's the way to proceed, at least for the Bayesian. And that's just the Bayesian methodology. There are other people, there are philosophers who think that the Bayesian methodology is incorrect. Like Graham Oppie favors a more just like worldview comparison approach, which doesn't make use of the Bayesian apparatus or the formal machinery or anything like that. Instead, he has a list of privileged theoretical virtues by which we are to assess respective hypotheses. We flesh out the hypotheses in full detail, and then we side with the hypothesis which best manages the trade-off between maximizing explanatory power and minimizing theoretical and ontological and ideological commitments. So in other words, trying to explain as much as you can with the least that you have. Basically like trying to have the simplest theory which explains the most. And I mean, it has similarities with the Bayesian approach, but it's importantly different. But him too, the appropriate methodology there, which he evinces with Kenny Pierce in his debate book, "What Is There a God? A Debate," in 2022, I think it was published. There again, you have to flesh out the respective hypotheses, and then you have to lay on the table all the relevant evidence: beauty, fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, consciousness, evolution, pain, pleasure, all that stuff. And then you try to systematically, you just try to apply the theoretical virtues and hope that at the end you come to the right conclusion. So I just mentioned two different methodologies here. No one has really sort of systematically proceeded through both of the methodologies. And given people have done things that approximate it, like Graham Oppie. Again, he's approximately done it with his. But again, he hasn't combed through all the relevant evidence. And his treatments of the relevant evidence, I mean, you would need like a book length treatment to adequately assess some of these. So, so yeah, how do you do this? I don't know. I mean, this is partly why I'm agnostic, because just even the methodology here is so overwhelmingly difficult. And there are even debates about what the correct methodology is, and it's hard to settle those. And you'd have to read almost unironically 1,000 papers or books to even settle that dispute about the right methodology to come to. So it's like, what is going on? So I don't really know. I mean, this is partly why I'm agnostic. Again, the best that I can tell people is we just try our hardest, right? We try to think about, are these hypotheses at least relatively elegant, simple? Do they have any kind of internal tensions among them? And then we see how well they explain the total range of data, and we make a rough assessment, we make a rough estimate or assessment of just the best picture of reality, given our reasons and evidence of which we're aware. And that's the best that we can do. And we can't really like in all seriousness, go through that whole Bayesian project, and likewise with the worldview design, like the worldview construction sort of thing. So then we just try our best, and we hope that the rest goes well.
And hope indeed we do. To perhaps to end off this video and to kind of, we started off with the direction of Christian YouTube, if that was even possible. Now, I might pose a different question, given the fact that you're studying PhD in philosophy in the States, and from some in the UK, I'm not exactly familiar with this. I'm wondering what the direction, and this is a kind of two-pronged question to end off this video. On one hand, what do you think is the direction that philosophy of religion is going in academia? And another question is, well, how actually is philosophy of religion received in academia? Because currently I've just finished submitting some of my PhD applications in the States, and one of a few of my mentors in the States were like, well, you might not want to emphasize this philosophy of religion that much because people normally don't like philosophy of religion that much. I'm not sure whether that's because they're continental philosophers or one of them just has come from a theistic background and found his journey in academia quite difficult. But that was some of the concerns that they've raised to me. I was wondering what your thoughts on that. Firstly, what direction philosophy of religion is going in academia, and secondly, how is philosophy of religion treated in the States?
Good questions. In terms of the direction, I mean, there are lots of different directions. I mean, philosophy of religion is actually a huge subfield of philosophy, and there are so many different aspects of philosophy of religion. There's the more like metaphysical side of philosophy of religion, where you're developing much more kind of metaphysical arguments for and against God's existence. Yeah, but certainly cosmological arguments, but also like teleological arguments and ontological arguments, and psychophysical harmony and all these sorts of things. These are much more on like the metaphysical side of philosophy of religion, and I mean that's still going strong, and that's going to continue. Like people are going to develop more and more arguments for and against God's existence. They're going to develop new objections to old arguments. They're going to develop new versions of the problem of evil. They're going to develop new responses, new theodicies. They're going to develop, I mean, all of this stuff is blossoming. And that's definitely going to continue. But there's also, other aspects of philosophy of religion. There's the epistemological side of philosophy of religion, where people are really looking at like the rationality of faith and like practical commitments and what to do in the face of religious disagreement. And like a lot of this stuff is much more on the epistemology side of philosophy of religion. And that's also a huge burgeoning subfield of philosophy of religion. And that's going to continue. I guess in terms of, and likewise, there are like ethics sides. There's an ethics side of philosophy of religion, and etc. I guess in terms of like interesting, maybe paradigm shifts of sorts in philosophy of religion, one thing that's going on in philosophy of religion right now is it's becoming much more globalized or much more global, thanks in large part to the work of Yuji Nagasawa. What do I mean by that? Well, at least traditionally, since like Plantinga and Swinburne, philosophy of religion has been like mostly just like a bunch of old white Christians talking about the Trinity and in the incarnation and like some arguments for and against God's existence and atheism and whatnot. That's like mostly what philosophy of religion has been for the last like, I don't know, like, prescinding from the last, 15 years or so, the preceding like 5 decades, that was like mostly what it was. But lately we're getting much more work exploring non-traditional views of God, Eastern views of God, Eastern views of religion, like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, all these other sorts of things. Certain non-traditional conceptions of God are getting much more traction. Pantheism, panentheism, limited God views, etc. So, and more scholars are being welcomed in, and their work is getting more and more traction from certain native religions and native traditions, from certain African religions and African traditions, East Asian stuff. Like philosophy of religion is blossoming to becoming more and more globalized, where people from a bunch of different backgrounds and religious traditions, including ones that are totally traditionally underrepresented or completely lack representation, like native religions, native traditions, African religions, African traditions, etc. Much more of that is coming to the fore, and people are doing actually really interesting, good work in these areas. So a more globalized direction for philosophy of religion, I think, recently has been on the cards, and it's going to continue being on the cards. Okay, so that's what I think. That's how I'd answer your first question. As for the second question about, I think it was just how philosophy of religion is viewed in the discipline.
Yes.
Well, it really does vary by the philosopher. Okay, so I mean that's the main answer. It varies. Now, at least in a lot of mainstream secular institutions, there is a decent bit of sentiment to the effect that, yeah, philosophy of religion is kind of like not the greatest subdiscipline. A lot of it seems to just, be pretty close to apologetics and not really proper philosophy. Some people view it as like the philosophy of werewolves, which is like, why would you philosophize about werewolves? There are no werewolves. We've moved on from that. That's like middle-aged superstition. So there is at least a decent bit of this sentiment in at least a decent number of secular institutions. Now, again, it's not like it's overwhelming or anything. I mean, like, Princeton, for instance, is like huge on philosophy of religion. I mean, we've got like the Princeton Project for Philosophy of Religion, 3PR here. Like some of our, I mean, off the top of my head, like a number of our faculty have worked, like published in philosophy of religion. Like at least like 4 or 5 have done that. There are a number of, like at least a decent number of religious people on our faculty. And like I said, we've got a huge like 3PR, Princeton Project for Philosophy of Religion. That's like a huge segment of the philosophy department dedicated to philosophy of religion. So it's definitely in the air here. We have conferences on it and so on. So my sense is that it's definitely taken seriously for the most part here. And in lots of other places too. I mean, Rutgers has their Center for Philosophy of Religion. They've got Dean Zimmerman, Brian Leftow, lots of others. Even Ted Sider has published stuff in philosophy of religion as well. Like he's got a paper in Faith and Philosophy on arguing against the doctrine of hell. I mean, and lots of other institutions are like that. So, I mean, it's again, it depends kind of on who you talk to and where you go. But there's no denying that there is that sentiment out there among at least a good deal of philosophers that philosophy of religion is a portion of it is an unserious discipline. It shouldn't, it's not taken too seriously by at least a number of philosophers, and there is that sentiment out there. Which is why I actually do also share that advice for people. Like, don't focus on philosophy of religion when you're applying. You can say you're interested in it. Like, I had to admit that I was interested in it because I'd published in it as an undergrad. So I'd be like, "You got me, hands up!" Like, I can't pretend it away. But it wasn't a centerpiece. Like I said, and I didn't lie about it. I said I'm going to be focusing on metaphysics in grad school, and I am. Like that, I'm doing a bunch of metaphysics stuff now. So that would be the advice for people: is to focus on the mainstream core areas of philosophy. At least, if you're applying to an analytic program, focus on either metaphysics or ethics or epistemology or like logic or philosophy of language or something like that, or just like formal methods more generally. Don't say philosophy of religion, but as your main area, you could say it as one of your sub sort of interests. But anyway, that's my advice.
Wonderful. So to close off, is there anywhere people can find you, people to get to know your work more? How would you direct people to, or where would you direct people to?
Onlyfans.com/Joe Schmid. I mean,
well, that's the most important thing,
right? Yeah.
New development of Christian YouTube.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Undiscovered niche.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. I mean, we said it earlier. Many people are saying this. It's the best channel that has ever existed. I mean, believe me, folks. I mean, it's great. It's great. Trust me. So yeah, YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. My website, josephschmid.com, has all my papers on it and other stuff. So people could check that out. My blog, majestyofreason.wordpress.com. I occasionally write responses to people on that. But yeah, the YouTube and my website are the main places. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the channel. It's great to talk to you, and I'm sure our listeners have really enjoyed it. Like always, if you have any thoughts or any guests you want on my channel next, then let me know in the comments below, and I'll try my very best to get them on. Stay safe, see you soon, and I'll see you in the next video.